Right, so today's discussion is with Claire McKay Bowen, the author of the recently published book, Protecting Your Privacy in a Data-Driven World. So thank you, Claire, for joining us. I am Martha McRoy, the current program chair for DC-AAPOR and your host for this session. DC-AAPOR's Book Club 2.0 series couldn't be possible without our DC-AAPOR program committee. So if this is your first time coming to Book Club 2.0, welcome. Our goal for the series is to provide a fun and interactive forum to review and discuss some of the latest publications in the field of survey methodology and public opinion research, and also be given the opportunity to engage directly with those responsible for these books. Claire is going to be presenting some highlights and key insights from her book. So please be sure to mute yourself unless asking a question or participating in the discussions. Claire will occasionally pause for questions throughout her presentation, so feel free to chime in then. You can also post thoughts and questions in the chat box as they come up, which we'll be monitoring throughout the session. And we're also going to open up the floor for discussion at the end of the presentation. So I encourage you all to turn on your cameras and ask your questions or provide feedback directly. You're also welcome to contribute reactions and comments to each other and with Claire. So remember, some of the most helpful insights often come from a more unstructured conversation. So let's try to mimic that while being on a Zoom call. And then at the end of the hour, I'm going to announce the name of a lucky DC-AAPOR member who's going to win a copy of Claire's book. So if you're interested in being eligible for winning those copies of books in future book clubs, consider becoming a DC-AAPOR member. You can do it through your AAPOR membership or directly on DC-AAPOR's website if you're not an AAPOR member and are not interested in being an AAPOR member. So now it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker. Claire McKay Bowen is a principal research associate in the Center on Labor, Human Services, and Population, and leads the Statistical Methods Group at the Urban Institute. Her research focuses on developing and assessing the quality of differentially private data synthesis methods and science communication. In 2021, the Committee of Presidents of Statistical Societies identified her as an emerging leader in statistics for her technical contributions and leadership to statistics and the field of data privacy and confidentiality. She's also a member of the Census Scientific Advisory Committee, an advisory board member of the Future of Privacy Forums, and an adjunct professor at Stonehill College. Dr. Bowen holds a bachelor's in mathematics and physics from the Idaho State University and a master's and PhD in statistics from the University of Notre Dame. After completing her PhD, she worked at Los Alamos National Laboratory, where she investigated cosmic ray effects on supercomputers. All right, over to you, Claire.
Thank you so much for the introduction. Hi, everybody. I'm very excited to be talking about my book. And as Martha said earlier, feel free to chime in your questions. This is very much unstructured. I'm just going to go like highlights, again, like Martha said, about my book, but not too in depth because I kind of want you to read the book. So I'm not going to give you all the punchlines here. So let's get started. So this is roughly the outline of my book where there's 7 chapters, and the first one talks about the motivation. They go in history, some background of like some of the issues that have been kind of addressed throughout the U.S. history about trying to expand access to data because of the privacy issues, some of the methodologies, going into current challenges. And I say ongoing challenges, and some of you might be thinking, well, when did you publish your book? I was like, well, it was back in 2021, but these problems are still going on. We didn't solve them all magically in a year. I wish that was the case, but that's not. And then go a little bit into privacy laws. This was a little bit of a stretch for me because that's not my area of specialty, but it's very much pertinent to what's going on with the federal statistical agencies and all the way down to the local government level. Because one of the main reasons, of course, for being restricted access to data is because of some privacy challenges. Oh, and I realized I was talking about this, but I didn't share my screen yet because I had shared it earlier and did not do that. So apologies, everybody, because I did it earlier thinking it was still up and it's not. So here we go. This is what I was talking about for the overview for the 7 chapters. Okay, so I talked about privacy laws here, and then my last chapter, I talked about thoughts for the future and some things that I think could or need to be addressed to tackle those kind of ongoing challenges from chapter 5 and some of the things that were discussed in chapter 6. So I'm going to just pause here for a moment just to show you what this was, because I thought I had this up earlier. So just for those to see that. And then this next slide here, I'm just highlighting what I'm going to be discussing here, because like I said, I'm not going to give you all the punchlines from my book. I'm going to talk about some of the motivation, some background, and some of the current methodologies. And one of the main reasons for methodologies is because I think the coolest thing that came out of my book was trying to figure out how to explain how to implement data privacy methods, but using a piece of art. And so for some of you who might have read The Art of Data Privacy from Significance magazine, the images in that article were taken out of my book. So motivation, and what do I mean by data privacy? So oftentimes when I say data privacy to somebody, I imagine that if you ask somebody that question, like a dozen different people, or all the people in this who are attending this webinar, people all have different ideas of what data privacy is. And especially when I talk to my family, they instantly think cybersecurity and hackers and everything, and which is definitely not what I do. And so I like to start off with an example that was this is one, an article from the New York Times back in December of 2019, where the reporters were able to get a hold of a data set that showed somebody's location over time, and that was it. But they were able to like track one person in particular and say, hey, this person obviously works at Microsoft because they're on Microsoft campus during working hours, and they obviously live in Redmond area. For those who don't know, that's in the Seattle area. Obviously live in Redmond because they're there during sleeping hours or during times that one would be likely at home. And then as they were tracking this person, they deviated from their pattern where they went to an Amazon campus for one afternoon and then went back to Microsoft. And then 2 months later started regularly going to Amazon. And that was enough information for that person, or for the reporters, to identify who this person was because of the LinkedIn profile. So they were able to identify the person as Ben Broly and figure that out because, again, LinkedIn showed him when he changed his job. And so you might be thinking, okay, that was way too much information. We shouldn't share that. But if I remember what I just said, all this data set had was this person's location and time. It didn't say their gender, it didn't have their name or anything like that. There's just so much auxiliary information around us and things that we can infer about data that allow us to identify people. And so then maybe the follow-up is like, well, obviously location over time is just too sensitive. We shouldn't release that. But because of that lack of information, we weren't able to actually do contact tracing. So that's what's actually needed to do that when the pandemic first started, is getting people's location and location over time. This information is also used for emergency responses. And so for those who don't know, I'm actually in New Mexico, where we had the worst forest fire season ever. Thousands of people lost their homes. And it's actually that GPS location on our smartphones that was able to figure out how to relocate people and where to identify them and figure out the best practices for that emergency. And that's not just New Mexico, but across the nation. But this lack of data access is what makes it so hard to help people, especially through public policy decisions, because again, we have these privacy concerns. Because I just said location over time, we were restricted. So that's why we couldn't do contact tracing. This is also why we don't have access to better public health data, is because it's very sensitive. And so when we needed that data for combating the pandemic, it wasn't there. And this is an article that I talk about this in the book. So it's a little bit dated now, but it's still really pertinent because even though you're trying to protect individuals, it could have these unintended consequences, because once you remove people from the data because of the privacy concerns, they become not represented in the data set, and then you can make improper health policy decisions. So somebody might argue like, well, we really need this data, so let's just remove the people who are too identifiable and then make our policy decisions based on that. And here's an example here where that was actually a bad practice. So for those who don't know, the Navajo Nation is one of the largest ones in the United States. It crosses over, or Native American nations, it crosses over Arizona and New Mexico. And the early messaging we had during the pandemic was like, wash your hands for 20 seconds. If you guys remember that, it was like, and that's why everyone was like, oh, use hand sanitizers, make sure you wash your hands because the soap will wash away the COVID. And the issue is that in the Navajo Nation, over 30% of the people don't have running water. So that messaging about washing your hands was not at all pertinent. And without better access to data, the impact for the Navajo Nation was like, I believe in May of 2020, they had the highest proportion of COVID cases in the United States that even exceeded New York City, which, if you guys remember back then, that was when New York City was having such like high death rates that they had to get, they had some interesting practices on trying to address the problems there. And then finally, things still didn't get better once we were like, oh my gosh, we have the vaccines. Like we can finally get over this pandemic here, but we still didn't have the proper data sets in order to address those kind of problems that, well, proportionally or disproportionately, the people of underrepresented groups were impacted more by COVID. And so we should roll out the vaccines more for those individuals. And because of that lack of information, we weren't able to combat it properly. So it's not like these problems haven't existed before. They've just been like exacerbated by the fact that we do have smartphones, that we do have social media and other information that's being collected. And so I talk in the book about like how we normally get access to this, to confidential data to make better policy decisions, because it isn't, again, like we didn't have these problems before, or these laws that were in place. Like some of these laws are still dated back from the 50s and we haven't updated since then. So how is it that public policymakers do access some of this data to make some of the decisions? And so I like to give people this kind of framework where we have these three different kind of layers. There you have the user interface layer, there's a privacy layer that's kind of in between the users who want access to the data. So we can think about the data users as public policymakers, researchers, data users, so on and so forth, who are saying, hey, I want some of these analyses I want done to make certain policy decisions. And so as the data privacy expert, I try to work with the data curator or steward or maintainer. So you might hear these terms interchangeably, which in my book, I state very clearly what terms I'm going to use to address each individual. So not to be too confusing, because the general literature is very inconsistent. So at least in my book, I'm very consistent because I clearly state who I mean for each group. So what do I mean by data curator and steward then? Those are the people who are ultimately like responsible for the collection or dissemination of the confidential data. So you can think of it as, for example, federal statistical agencies who collect information like census, and they're responsible for that confidential data. And so that looks like my title changed there, but ignore that. So the thing is with the privacy expert, they work in tandem with the data curator and trying to figure out, okay, so once we figure out what statistics should be highlighted because based on the analyses that data users want, then we need to alter those statistics in such a way to protect the privacy of the individuals or records that are in the data. And in statistics, we call this statistical disclosure control or limitation. And so that's just the broader field of doing data privacy and confidentiality methodology to expand access to data. And so with that, you get some results out before leaving that privacy layer to be able to get to the data users. So this is like the summary tables and statistics, or in a public micro data set. So some examples are sometimes you get the statistics from the Bureau of Labor Statistics talking about the unemployment rates, or they have their micro or close to micro public data. It's not quite at the level you may want. It's the quarterly census of employment wages, QCEW. Yes. Okay. There's a lot of, you guys are all in DC. You guys all have acronym soup. It's sometimes hard for me to remember. Anyways, moving on from here. So trying to get to the title, which I kind of did it prematurely because I incorrectly copied my slides, which is, why is it hard to implement this framework? Well, one thing is it's really hard to predict everything that somebody might do with a data set. So what data curators try and should do, because sometimes they don't do it, is they should communicate properly with the stakeholders, those or data users, those who are going to use the data, and figure out what are they going to use it for. And so to highlight the statistics or data from the confidential data set and make sure those are kind of preserved. But it's sometimes hard when the data set might be used for thousands of reasons and some that you would never predict. So a classic example is the census data, right? We just had the 2020 census. It's a very important data set that you're using for allocation of congressional seats, figure out federal budgets, and many other things. But one of my favorite like random examples is apparently a county in Ohio uses that data to figure out how many restaurant permits that they allocate. And it's not like census is going to benchmark the quality of their data on that, but that's just an example of like all the random things people might use the data for that you might have to kind of think about in terms of trying to preserve quality. And it also is hard to implement that kind of framework, or at least what I presented with those different layers, because you also have to find what you mean by privacy, because that's going to adjust how you're going to implement some of your statistical disclosure methods. Because what do you mean by somebody might be attacking the data? Is it they're going to try to identify a group of people or just one person? Or are they trying to make certain kind of predictions based on the data set? it gets kind of ad hoc in that case there. So I'm going to pause right here and see if anybody has any questions or if anything I said was a little confusing, or maybe I'm talking too fast, because I know that sometimes I get really excited, especially when I talk about privacy, and I just talk really fast.
I do actually have a quick question for you, Claire, because you mentioned about confidential data. How is that different than, say, PII that we're normally worried about?
That's a great question. So the way I define confidential data is, so we're going to take one little step back. So I would call the original data is the data that the data curator first collects. Okay, so we'll use census. So census will do the count, trying to count, as I said, like every person once and in the right place. I think that's their mission statement. And so the original data is just them collecting all the surveys and getting it, the follow-up responses, things like that. It's uncleaned, right? It's just what is the raw gathered data. So I call that the original data. What I call the confidential data is after census has cleaned it and has all the values, like original values from the data set, which could include PIIs or personally identify information, or could maybe not, but just say, hey, there's like maybe one identifier, but then has like statuses of, I'm thinking like health carols and like HIV or cancer status or things like that. At least with census, it's like identifying the particular household, maybe the relationships within for each individual in the household and where they're located. And now I believe this is the first census that we're asking about marriage, or was like more detailed demographic information, including like Middle Eastern origins too. So that could be considered sensitive. So that would be the confidential data. And then what's publicly released is those the data products that have been altered because it can be too identifiable. So that could be the redistricting data is one of the products. And then there's the demographic housing characteristics file is another product that comes out from census that's considered a public use file, but has been altered because of privacy concerns. Did I answer your question? Was that too much?
No, that makes sense. So basically the PII makes it very easy to say that this is this person. The confidential data can be something that is too risky to disclose, where it could kind of get back to being able to identify the person. And then you have the data that's released that should not have any PII and should mask confidentiality, if I understand correctly.
Yeah, the reason I was being a little bit vague about whether or not it includes PII for the confidential data is sometimes people will consider a data set confidential even if it doesn't include people in it, because it could just include like relationship between certain groups or institutions, and that would still be considered confidential. Any other questions, comments, concerns, complaints, quandaries? I hear nothing, so we'll keep going. All right, so it's going back to, it's really hard to kind of balance that kind of like tension. I didn't call it a tension, but it's like a trade-off between the usefulness of the data, so making sure things are accurate, but still preserving the privacy of individuals. And so I tell people that it's akin to like holding sand at times, where you're trying to hold as much sand as possible, but then you have to shift a little bit because you're like, oh, wait a minute, the utility of this data set is not good, so I need to shift something on my hand. But then when that happens, like sand could spill out in unexpected ways. So then this case would be that while you improve the quality of the data in one aspect, you could do diminishing the privacy guarantee. Because again, it's a tension. You can't have all the usefulness of the data and all the privacy of it. And so kind of hinting it to this painting here. So this is a famous Seurat painting. For those who don't know, Seurat is like considered the master of pointillism. So this is one of his most famous artwork. It's in the Art Institute in Chicago. And so perhaps, let's say this is representative of a data set, it's like social economic data set, and you realize, wow, there's a lot of high income earners, or not a lot, excuse me, there's high income earners and there's not as many of them. So we need to protect those individuals. So let's say they represent the lighter pixels in this data set. So I'm just going to cut them off, saying like, okay, somebody makes more than 200,000 or something like that. But when you do that, you kind of get this kind of weird image here where you're like, okay, I can barely tell that there are people in a park. And at this point, I can't tell if there was a lake originally, but that's what I really wanted, is that people to see this the painting still for it what it was, which was figures in a park with a lake and a sky. But because I lightened it so much, because I was trying to protect the high income earners, now it's pretty distorted, and it's kind of, again, hard to tell their figures in the park. So now you're trying to make another adjustment here. You're like, okay, that doesn't work. Maybe I should just round people's income values. Maybe that will be enough. And so you do this and you're like, okay, I round everything. So I just softened everything up. But now it's just really unfocused. I can kind of tell there are people there, but maybe that's not, like, it's hard to tell between a person and a dog that was in the park. Maybe that's a lake, maybe that's sky. I have no idea. So this is going back to what I said before, which is like that tension of trying to hold parts of the data set or balancing between the usefulness and the privacy with holding sand, is that when you make one adjustment and try to correct for another, you kind of have to go back and forth and keep iterating through it to figure out what it's like at the right balance. So again, pausing here before going into like kind of the methodology and what people do to address these problems here. All right, I'm going to keep going because I hear no complaints. So going into what I just said about that tension between balancing privacy and utility. So as the data curator and the privacy expert, along with the data user, you have to determine what you mean by privacy loss or risk and usefulness. So I'm going to go through some of the definitions that some of the privacy experts have defined, or the Federal Statistical Agency, actually it's in Working People, they define these as well. And this is what's covered in the book too. So one way to identify risk is like very obvious one is identity disclosure risk. It's being able to identify somebody in the data set. So a classic way is to what's called record linkage attack, where this one data set that you have altered for privacy purposes, you try to protect the individuals, but then someone takes another data set and able to overlap similar characteristics and then identify people. So this actually happened where at the Harvard University, they tried to collect a bunch of medical data to try to, well, the main motivation was to do personalized medicine, because that's like one of the big things is that wouldn't it be great to collect enough information to help address people's diagnosis more quickly. And so they did remove the PIIs, all the personally identifiable information, but they kept a few characteristics because it's good to have some of that demographic information to figure out if there's certain correlations for diseases. Well, a different Harvard researcher, a computer scientist, took voter data and was able to identify 21% of the data set based on the commonalities of zip code, gender, and date of birth. And that's a little bit scary because, like, although I don't usually care if people know if I'm registered as a voter or what kind of party affiliation. I say usually because the political environment's really interesting right now. But I do care if people know why I'm being diagnosed or in a particular healthcare data set. So that gets very sensitive. Another example, or another type of risk is called attribute disclosure risk. It's where you can identify like a group of people and be able to target them for that certain kind of characteristic. So I have this example here because I can imagine that now that we're getting closer, well, hopefully the end of a pandemic, I don't know, I'm still masking when I go out, so still feels like we're in the pandemic here, where early closures, like, so this was in March of 2020, where only people could move about if they were an essential worker. So what's to stop somebody to take a data set with the location over time and be able to identify like, oh, these people are obviously essential workers because they were moving during the closures. And so those group of people, again, identify them as essential workers, and then later on target them for health insurance, or raised up their health insurance because they're more likely to have long COVID. And then finally, inferential disclosure risk. This is one of the hardest ones to predict because it is basically a relationship predicting disclosure risk. It's saying that using the publicly available statistic or data set that was released based on that confidential data, you're going to use that to make inferences for or stronger predictions about individuals or group of people. So the reason I have a picture of a smartphone is that there were some researchers out of Stanford, I think it was mid 2010s, where they were able to see that based on kind of frequency and the time that people would be calling certain health institutions, they could predict whether or not somebody had a higher percentage of, or have a higher probability of that person having certain cardiac disease. Also predicting whether or not they were owning firearms, which was a really interesting also twist on that article as well. So that could be, it's again very difficult to predict how somebody might think of like what kind of models to use against the data set, but that is one that some statistical agencies have to think about. So of course I have to talk about differential privacy because I don't know if anybody is aware of this. This has been a very hot topic discussion throughout, especially with census, because they implemented their 2020 census using differential privacy. But I'm going to pause here for a moment and see if anybody had any questions about those other measures of risk I talked about. I hear nothing. Okay, so I just mentioned that it was a little bit of like predicting how somebody might attack the data set. Is it a group of people? Is it a single person? Is it like using a model? So that's actually the measures that we've used for decades. I say we as privacy researchers in statistics, but the problem is, again, it's very ad hoc, right? You have to predict how someone has hacked the data. So this is why it was so revolutionary to have this new privacy definition called differential privacy. I'm going to stress here again, differential privacy is a privacy definition. It is not a method, because people keep calling it a method and it's not. It's what a method needs to satisfy to be considered differentially private. Anyways, that's my end of my little, if you're going to take anything away from my talk, get that one. And so why was differential privacy so revolutionary? Because it basically took those other definitions I just talked about, threw them out the window and said, clean slate, let's think of what is the maximal privacy loss that could result from a publication? Like, what is the absolute worst case scenario? So it thought about all current data sets that could happen or that could be out there, what future data sets could be occurring if somebody had unlimited computational power. And given all those data sets and computational power, what if somebody who's like attacking the data had all the information about one record, and that one record is the one that they're trying to get, and that's the attack being done on the data. So this is what differential privacy does at a very high level. It's trying to predict, again, the worst case scenario. And the idea is that it's trying to figure out all the little pieces that people might take in order to get a clearer picture of that one individual. And so this is sometimes referred to as the mosaic effect. Again, taking small pieces of information to get that bigger picture. The other thing to think about differential privacy is that it provides a knob that adjusts between that trade-off between privacy and accuracy. So I talked about this tension between having really accurate data and also really private data. But differential privacy, because it assumes the worst case scenario, it now gives you a parameter or value to input in to make that kind of trade-off and adjust it, like I said, like a knob. So an idea is to think about like the extremes of what do I mean by privacy and accuracy. So when I tell people, it's like, think of worst case scenario. Why is this a tension? Why can't you have both the privacy and accuracy? Well, a very private data is it not ever being released. You just get nothing. You just get this black void. You have no idea what that data is. Well, I'm going to increase epsilon here, this knob, to get more accuracy. So I'm going to crank it up and I start getting a better picture in mind. It's still really fuzzy, but at least now I know what color this painting is supposed to be. And then I'm going to increase epsilon a little bit more. And so the picture starts getting a little bit better. And before you know it, I finally get a better picture if I crank up epsilon all the way up. And now I get the idea of what this painting is. And so I just mentioned was the tension, because like on one hand, ultimate privacy is not releasing data. So what's ultimate accuracy? You release the full data. So this is why you can't have both accuracy and privacy. And you have to figure out what is that tension in between, like what is the middle ground that you're going to do in order to release the information that you want to help make better public policy decisions. The other thing about differential privacy, because again, you can quantify the privacy loss, because again, you were looking at the worst case scenario, is that you can now get this, it composes and computes. So you basically are now being able to track your bill on how you're releasing information. So at a very simple level, let's just say, here's our confidential data, and I am going to do 2 public data sets from it. So in this case here, I have an epsilon of 1 for one data set and epsilon 2 for another. So based on the definition for differential privacy and some of the theorems associated to it, the total privacy loss here is now 3. But if I'm able to partition that data or just make disjoint sets of it and then create the public data based on those disjoint sets, then the total losses then becomes just 2. And this is mathematically quantified with differential privacy, which is why it's so powerful, because before we couldn't do this under the more traditional methods. And you keep hearing me say traditional methods, and what do I mean by that? Well, in going back to our kind of framework here, where I said there's a user layer, a privacy layer, and data access layer, I talked about the traditional like statistical disclosure control methods. And then the way I'm framing it is saying that, well, now we have this kind of parallel way of releasing summary table statistics and microdata or synthetic data. And I'm putting this in parallel because even though the broader field of statistical disclosure control or methods of data privacy and confidentiality incorporates both those traditional methods and discussions I just had, or definition I talked about earlier, and differential privacy, there are such different ways of thinking how to expand access to data and other information that I consider them in two different buckets. And this is why I adjusted the framework in this way, where we see them in parallel. So I just talked about how we evaluate the disclosure risk, but then how do we evaluate usefulness? And again, this has been going on for decades. And so roughly statisticians say, hey, there's kind of two ways we can look at evaluating the usefulness of data. There's one called general or global utility, where you look at distributional similarity between the confidential and released data or statistics. The other one is more specific utility, where you're saying, hey, there's a public policymaker who wants to do this kind of analysis, and they want to see whether or not, or I say this is they with privacy researcher, the data curator, along with the data users, saying that after you do analysis, would it the same outcome or decision be the same if you applied it to the confidential data and the publicly released data? So one of the ways to figure out the distribution aspects is there's like a new-ish, I say not brand new, it came out in the 2000s, but a new-ish way of evaluating the quality of a publicly released data set. So the idea is that you take the confidential data and the publicly released data, and you take those records and you combine them all together and basically shake them up in a box. It's like you can think of that at high levels, like shake them all in the box and see whether or not you can put a model to separate between observations that came from the confidential data or the publicly released data. So in this case here, this image was created by a colleague of mine. He labeled the pink dots as the original data and then the blue dots as synthetic data. And so here it's really hard to separate these observations. You can tell like they're all mixed up together. There's no way to draw like basically a line between them. Like how will I separate these two values? So if that's the case, then you say that this is very high quality synthetic data because it's hard to distinguish it from the original data. But then if you can draw a line, so in this case here, it's easy to separate and look at between the original data and the synthetic data here. So we can easily draw like a diagonal line between these two kind of groupings here. And so in this case, you would say like, well, the synthetic data does not very much look like the original data, so it's not very high quality. And I just realized I've been using the term synthetic data. I haven't quite defined it yet, so just bear with me. Just let's call it this the publicly released data. So an example for figuring out for like specific utility. So this actually was an example that we at Urban were working on with. So found out that water utility bill delinquency is a good indicator if somebody is about to become homeless. And so this one city wanted to allow local nonprofits to access this water delinquency data set. However, because of privacy concerns, they can't. And so they're trying to see whether or not they can release certain kind of summary statistics out, like say like maybe at a block or neighborhood level, where whether or not interventions could still be made and having a similar impact. So like whether or not those nonprofits would have access to the confidential data. So I thought this was like a very interesting application and one that we're still actively working on. All right, I'm going to pause here before going back to my artwork and see if anybody has any questions about what I just talked about.
So Claire, this is Stas. So my understanding of the differential privacy stuff is that originally it was developed with an understanding that epsilon is going to be tiny, like 0.01 or something like that. And now we have to live in the world where epsilon is 50.
Yes.
So the definition basically says the probabilities differ by exponent of epsilon. So exponent of e to power 50 is basically infinity. So I understand that there's a value in the composition theorems and saying that we can chunk that differential, that privacy budget and rely on composition theorems and say, well, this is how we think of privacy and allocating relative importance to the different parts of the privacy. But can you comment on this epsilon inflation? Do you have an opinion on that? Is it controversial? Is it difficult? Thank you.
So just backing up a little bit for people. So what Stas is talking about is that very much in early literature for differential privacy, everything was very theoretical. People said, okay, you can't have zero because epsilon zero would just say you never release the data. So it has to be very close to zero. So literature said like, oh, ideally an epsilon 1 would be great. Like the upper bound should be roughly like 2 or 3. Like that's it. And especially because it's on an exponential scale. So it's not just saying like it's 1, it's like exponential 1, which equals 2 point. The ratio would be then 2.72, if I remember correctly, how that conversion works. So that was what early literature said. Now that we're seeing more and more applied work, everything's now getting much larger. So for a reference point, again, I said like early literature said 1 or 2 for epsilon. Now the 2020 census, the person file, because they split the redistricting data into 2 parts. They split 1 to a person's file and 1 to a household file. The person file is 17.14 and the other one is 2.63, something like that. Anyways, I know the combined total is like 19.7 or something like that. So that's much larger than everybody saying that it should be 1. And other applications, there's a great paper by some researchers at LinkedIn that were looking at all the big tech competitors and like all their applications of differential privacy. And they have this table where they look at the cost or the epsilon value for daily and monthly cost. So it wasn't just like one-off like data set. It's like people continuously querying at the data set. And one of the largest values was over 700 monthly value for the data set. And it's like, that's insane. Like as somebody who's been researching this for many years, I was like, wow, who would ever thought there would be an application where they put 700, and definitely on an exponential scale, that is approaching very much into infinity. So why I'm telling you all this is that differential privacy, we still need to figure out more and more applied applications. So like my opinion is we need more use cases, because the other thing is we have not a good interpretation of what epsilon means. So what I talked about earlier with the traditional methods, it was very intuitive. People are like, okay, being able to identify a person or a group of people or have a probability of inferring more sensitive information from the data set. Now you're going to differential privacy where you're like, hey guys, do you know what an epsilon of 10 is versus 15 versus 1 versus like now there's a value out there at 700? You have no clue. The only idea you have is like you increase the value. So one examples that I've been thinking about is telling people like, okay, everybody has a good sense of what a dollar is, like what's $1 versus $2 versus $10, like what you can buy with that, right? So thinking like, okay, I know what kind of quality I can get with 10 US dollars, right? Well, right now differential privacy said, hey, no, we're now on yen. So you know that if you get more yen, you could get a higher quality product, but you're just not sure between what is like 1 yen versus 10 yen versus 1,000 yen. Like what is the amount of quality you're going to get with that? And then if any of you are going like, well, I'm just going to go on my smartphone and just figure out what the conversion rate is between US dollars and yen. Like, no, we don't have that conversion right now in this area of research. Like no idea what does it mean between getting the quality of data we want and what is epsilon value. So now you're probably wondering, you didn't quite answer Stas's question about like what you think about all of this. It's like reemphasizing, one, we need more practical applications so we can help figure out what is that conversion rate, like what is $1 US to what questionable like yen amount that is. So 2, then having better communication, which I'll talk about a little bit later. And then 3 is to figure out a way to help translate between, again, so this goes back to number 1, but it's like a little more nuanced. So I said in 1 is to do more practical applications. I'm going to go into the third part is like, we need to have like maybe an alternative kind of definition, or at least apply both definitions, the traditional and the differential privacy one, because even though they're not one-to-one, at least then you can ground people into what they're familiar with to like converting over to the newer definition. Hopefully that wasn't too rambly. Did I answer your question? Did that make sense? Did I just make you have more questions about this area?
I do have just one quick confirmation question then. So the larger the epsilon value, that means the more stuff that was done to the data to protect it before releasing it, correct?
No, so
Yeah.
higher epsilon means more accuracy.
More accuracy. Okay, my mistake.
So it'd be like, oh, with 1 yen, do I get a water bottle, or can I get like, oh, how much more do I need to get a laptop, or maybe a diamond encrusted laptop? I don't know. You just don't know what your spending power is like. So you're trying to buy more accuracy, I guess is one way to think of it.
Okay. Thanks.
Any other questions? Complaints? All right, so we're going to go right into this artwork again that I think was the coolest part of my book. I was trying to help explain how we protect data. This is in particular, I was trying to figure out how to explain this to my family, because I don't know if anybody knows, like I'm a first generation college student, so trying to explain some of what I do to my family is sometimes difficult. So I was thinking, well, again, this raw painting is the confidential data. I still want people to recognize that it's figures in a park, that there is some trees and there's lake and there's some sky. And so some of the ways that people try to protect data, again, this is going to be a mix of both what could be done with differential privacy or with the traditional definitions of privacy. So one of the classic ways is just suppression. You just remove people from the data set or records from the data set because they're just too sensitive. So it's really easy and quick. Right here, we still get the broader picture of figures in the park, but there's some people missing. This seems great, but we already talked about how if you do that, those individuals tend to be the ones who are already underrepresented, and you're making them further underrepresented in the data set. So you're not going to make the proper decision making that you need to do. Another method is to do generalization. So again, imagine this data set was like social economic data. And so a very classic example is that putting people into broader groups for education. So instead of saying somebody doesn't have high school, GED, high school, bachelor's of arts, bachelor of science, or associate's degree, master's degree, PhD, like all those like fine grained, you can just say like high school or equivalent, undergraduate 4-year college, undergraduate 2-year, and graduate. And then you just have those broader bins. So the way I do this for this painting is to pick one color green, one color blue, one color brown, so on and so forth. So you still get an idea of this, but of what this painting is, but you're like, kind of looks a little weird. It's a little bit extreme, but I still get the figures in the park though. Another method is called sampling. So this was originally done because it's really expensive to count everybody once in the right place. The decennial census like motto there. And so when they were doing other kind of collection, they're like, oh, what if we sample people? And so this actually could be treated as a privacy technique, because there you can like plausibly deny it whether or not you're part of the data set. So to say like, oh, if somebody, one of your friends like, well, I found this person that resembles you in this data set, you can say like, well, that's not me, especially because it's like a 10% sampling rate. So akin for this painting is just randomly sampling the pixels from it. And so here's just like a zoomed up version where you can see some of the pixels have been removed. In this case here, the sampling rate, because again, this was like higher resolution picture, the sampling rate is 70%. So that way people could still get an idea what it looked like. Because when I did a much lower rate that was known for some public data sets, which are like about 10 to 20%, you can really see this image. But again, I guess you guys get the general idea of what's going on here. Another way to protect data is noise infusion. So especially if you have continuous values like income, you want to add a little bit or subtract a little bit. You can also do this for like age groups too. So instead of saying someone is 42, you can say that they're 40 instead, and it's something that's really close. So in this case here, the pixels were randomly darken and lighten using a uniform distribution, actually, just to kind of see how this works. Like, it's a little bit hard to tell what the original painting was, but it kind of looks like snow from a tube TV is what I kind of think about it. But you get the general idea of what was going on. And then finally, I kept mentioning synthetic data. So here's the punchline. So synthetic data is creating pseudo records or fake records based on a statistical model, or like a model that you're trying to highlight certain statistical characteristics from the data. So let's, for instance, say like, hey, the people are way more important than the other parts of the painting here. So I really want to highlight them, and everything else in the background can be faded out. And so going back to our framework where we have the user, privacy, and data layer, so you can think about these stand-ins as like, okay, the original Seurat painting is the confidential data, and then we're going to figure out certain statistics. We're going to test a few different privacy preserving methodologies, kind of iterate through, and before deciding what is the ultimate result that we want to share with data users. Oh yeah, I should have done stick figures. That would have been great. That's what Stott said in the chat. All right, so some challenges. There's a lot of different challenges, and I know this was kind of like the punchline, but there's one in particular I really want to highlight before ending my talk, which is trying to figure out better communication materials, which goes into something I just I said earlier when answering Stott's question. So I like posing this question to people, which is like, what resources would you recommend on machine learning? And usually when I ask people this question, they have an idea of like, oh, I have one for introductory level, intermediate, or somebody who wants to do more advanced. I had like a great book or a blog or a video. Or are you an economist? Or are you a social scientist? Are you a demographer? Like, right? There's lots of resources available for all different levels, for different programming languages, for different kind of backgrounds, technical or otherwise. So I'm going to safely assume that's the same here. So just keeping that in mind versus if you were to ask the same question, but on data privacy, and in particular, the area that I'm talking about in this talk and in my book. I imagine the answer is much more limited, and you can't say my book as an example. So that's a big problem, is that despite the fact that this area of research impacts all the statistical agencies at the federal level, all the trying to expand access at the state, local level, other institutions trying to work together, both research, academic, big tech is looking at these problems too. There's just very little resources on trying to educate people what is the kind of code that is needed to implement some of the methodology, so on and so forth. So one of the things I say this in the book, I've now updated saying bike instead of car, but in the book I talk about how you don't need to know how to build a car in order to drive it, right? But the problem is there's just not enough cars for people to drive because we don't have enough code base for people to implement the code. So why did I say updated this? Cool. I'm trying to be more environmentally conscious and realizing saying more cars on the road is not good. So let's just say bike. We need more bikes on the road. So you don't need to know how to build a bike in order to ride that bike. So that's the analogy I have with trying to get more materials to get more code to implement the methods, because you need to know enough to know that which method to use, but not how to build it. And that's one of the issues that we had. And then with that, hopefully this interests you more in my book. Again, this was just like some of the introductory part. I talk more about the challenges, more of the thoughts of the future for this field in the book. I'm happy to take more questions or just have a general discussion. Here's my contact information as well. And thank you so much for having me. And I see in the chat, yeah, there's a book by Dreschler about data synthesis, which I actually have it back there. I see back there. So there's a little bookshelf I have. Jorg Dreschler published that book back in 2011. So it's a little, only slightly dated, but still a really useful book. And I've talked with him recently about him needing to update that book. So I think he's thinking about it.
Great. Thank you so much for your presentation and walking us through some of the key takeaways from your book. And also, it's definitely making me really interested in reading more of your book. I've also heard really good things from people that are not necessarily statisticians or data privacy experts that have been using your book to help implement some changes. And they've all said that it is very easy to follow for non-statisticians. So I know that's not always the easiest thing to do in our field. So good job. And I'd like to now open it up if anyone has additional questions for Claire. Please feel free to turn on your camera, unmute yourself and ask directly, or if you'd like to start a discussion on all this.
Okay, I'm gonna stop sharing screen for now.
Everyone's so quiet.
It's fine.
Hi, Paul.
Claire.
Go ahead.
Hey, Paul Schroeder with CoPass. Just want to ask the question. I mean, this all scares me so much, right? So, because we have to be right all the time, and the people who are doing nefarious things with data or wanting to do nefarious things with data just have to be right once, right? So, it seems to me it harkens back to the early days of the internet and software and hackers and how they're always one step ahead of us. So with that in mind, I'm just trying to figure out how is epsilon, the knob, that you refer to, how is that not always dialed down closer to zero, and that we were able to buy more accuracy, knowing that if we wrong in that, if someone gets into the data and gets out, a lot of what the work that we do, that the federal statistical agencies do, is really put into jeopardy if we have a disclosure. That just seems to be an overriding fear that I have, that how do we release any data with that fear in the back of our minds?
Yeah, that's a great point. So I'm going to try to piece this out a little bit. So going back to like the early internet comment, it's actually one of my favorite examples to talk about how early encryption or just like trying to encrypt the internet. So that whole area of research started in the late 70s, it's like 1976 to 78, something like that. And so if we were to age that up to how old differential privacy is. So for those who don't know, differential privacy was invented in 2006. So it's 16 years old. So if you age up encryption, you're putting itself into the 90s. And so do you trust internet encryption back in the 90s?
Right.
Probably not, but we shouldn't have stopped there, right? Because now the internet is encrypted. Now we have the HTTPS, like, right? You see the little lock on your browser. And that's because you have to keep working on these methods and see and apply it to real applications in order to figure out all the challenges. And that was like one of my biggest issues as a early research, when I was first researching differential privacy, was like all the early research was like making vast assumptions on how the data set was constructed, or assumptions on like what external information one can use to help make the results more accurate, things like that. So again, just hearkening, re-emphasizing, it's good to make more applications. Now to what you just said, Paul, which is the whole, and what you said is echoing what my students said at Stonehill. They're like, oh, well, no offense, Dr. Bowen, but you're scaring the F out of me with your class, right? That was like one of the takeaways I got from my students. The problem is that if we just lock down everything, you can't do your job as like for the federal statistical agencies. And there is this balance with like, at what point would you sacrifice your personal privacy in order to do the public good? So like a more simple example would be, I know Google tracks everything. It's really, really, really creepy, but I really like the fact that I can use Google Maps because I'm directionally impaired. And also that I do long distance triathlons. So I go on these long runs and bike rides, and my spouse can track me like a sea turtle. And that's the benefit. And that's something that we need to have a broader discussion in terms of like with public policymakers, with the data users, with privacy experts and the data curators, which will be the federal statistical agency, is figuring out what that balance is, because you can't have perfect privacy because that's just locking up the data. And the users are saying like, but we need more accurate data to make these policy decisions. And so but you can't fully expose it. So there is going to be an inherent risk, right, to trying to figure out what is that balance in between. And we just need to have those open conversations. So again, hearkening to, we need more applications. We need to have more open conversations. That means we need more communication materials in order to like make that happen. I know that wasn't like a perfect answer, but that's some of the thoughts I have there.
No, great. Thank you.
Oh yeah, and to Stas's point too, is that census did have to crank up the values because epsilon or differential privacy does assume the worst case scenario. And so it actually distorted the data quite a bit because of that worst case scenario. So a lot of data users said like, I can't use this data for what I need. So they did quote unquote crank up epsilon. Sorry, go ahead, Martha.
Oh, I was just going to say, I was opening it up then for the next question. So I'm not sure if Tim or Eileen. Eileen, go ahead.
I don't believe Tim doesn't have a question, first of all. Hi, Tim. So Claire, this is a great book because it makes it accessible to a much broader audience than the folks that are on this call right now. And that's always a great tool to throw at people that you have to explain things to. The rest of us have to explain things to our families too. I want to think a minute about administrative records versus surveys and censuses. There's really no expectation of privacy at some level with administrative records, because you volunteer a lot more information and detail about yourself in order to receive a benefit. But I guess I'm concerned that the expectations of accountability that should go with those administrative records, like billions getting distributed to the right people, billions making, effective change and so on, and in the society and culture and so on, are being foisted on surveys and censuses because we provide the benchmark. So that said, what are your thoughts on how the level of underutilization of administrative records toward these goals in concert with the benchmarks?
Oh, this is a great question because it's funny that I'm working on the project with IRS to release their administrative data because they do have a public use file, but it's a restricted access public use file because it is taxpayer data. So going back to like what you made a comment, because we are non-response rates are all-time high now, and people are talking about how we should leverage administrative data because for various benefits reasons, it's like much higher quality, right? Like, was it like the Bureau of Labor Statistics has really high quality data on establishments because in order to get a certain benefit, which is like insurance, they have to file through their agency. So it's like very high quality data. It's like an accuracy of like, or an accuracy is like 95% of the businesses all file it or something like that. So it's like, wow, that's super rich versus, what was it, the census? So it had an average response rate of like below 60%, something like that. It was like, that's abysmal, or around 60%. So that's like really terrible. So going to your comment, I think that's where we're going to have to move forward because, and I'm looking at Tim. I'm trying to look at Tim. Tim is our survey person at Urban, talking about how survey responses are so bad. So we need to start, or people have been talking more about leveraging administrative data, but because it's so sensitive and has certain kind of information, it makes it trickier to balance that privacy usefulness like trade-off right there. So one of the things I talk about in the book, but I didn't talk about in my slides, was talking about maybe we need to expand access into like a different kind of tiered system, because what I talked about earlier in that framework was the two extremes of you get a public data set, which could be highly altered, or certain records are just removed because of privacy concerns, or you get direct access, which the problem with like, I'm not sure if everybody knows this, but to get direct access to data, it gets a little bit tricky, especially if it's administrative data, because you have to be a US citizen and go through a clearance process and like all this other like hassle stuff, right? So is there a way somewhere like can expedite it and in between access, which is looking at like a kind of like a validation server kind of process, which is something that we're looking into at Urban Institute in collaboration with IRS to see if that could be like a middle ground where you have a trusted researcher, but they don't have to go through the full clearance process, or the fact that most researchers, or a good chunk of them, are not US citizens, so they're just ineligible anyway. So that was a little rambly. Hopefully I got to kind of your question there.
Oh, if you want something, but let's get Stas. I mean,
oh, Stas.
Yeah, so I wonder if you could ramble a little bit about the software. So I know that Census did their stuff in Python, and there are several R packages, including the work that you have on synthetic data. Jörg Drexler has his app, his Shiny app. Well, his stuff that's out in his book, and then he has R package that goes into the Shiny app where you can sort of play around with how you want to suppress stuff and see what implications of data privacy are for that. What else is out there? What else are you aware of?
Oh, for software.
Yeah.
Before you answer that question, because we are at time, I will let you answer, don't worry. I just wanted to first be respectful of others that might have to hop off. So I wanted to give you one more big thank you, Claire, for participating in the series, and everyone that was able to attend. And I just wanted to quickly announce the book winner. So the DC-AAPOR member that won a copy of your book is Mara Spiegelman. So thank you so much for attending, and I'll be in touch shortly, Mara, about sending you a copy of the book. And also, just as the interim elections are starting to ramp up, our next book club meeting is going to be on October 20th, where we'll have author W. Joseph Campbell, who will be talking about his book, Lost in a Gallup, Polling Failures in the US Presidential Elections. And finally, I did post in the chat a link to a Google form that's just a quick 90-second survey, just asking about how the session went. So I'd greatly appreciate it if you could take 90 seconds out of your afternoon to fill that out. And now, Claire, I will let you answer Stas's question about software and how to implement data privacy.
So beyond what is available, there's SynthPop, which is R-based, that's out of the UK, or University of Edinburgh is maintaining it. That's focused on synthetic data. For some differential privacy, I would look at OpenDP. It's a community developed or being maintained by Harvard in collaboration with Harvard and Microsoft. So they're trying to do a code base there, but it's in Rust and Python. They're trying to do some updates in R, but that's the main focus there. Some libraries exist from Google, some Google, Microsoft, Apple. So I think Apple has it proprietary, so that's locked up. And LinkedIn, I think, has it open source. So those are other places, but again, they're very limited. I say very limited because like the queries that they're doing for differential privacy, and I say queries, it's statistics. Computer scientists likes to say queries, statisticians likes to say statistics. It's limited right now.
Great. Thank you all so much. And Claire provided her information if you have more questions. And we will be posting this recording on DC-AAPOR's YouTube channel too. So thank you all, and I hope you all have a great rest of your afternoon.
Thanks for coming, guys.